All right, so I guess we are live. We're doing a follow-up video on divination, specifically auguries and scrying. I think the last video we did on divination, I received so many great questions from y'all about kind of these earlier forms of divination, which is great because it means you're taking an interest in kind of the older stuff, which is what I love. Instead of more new agey things like tarot cards and stuff, which are great and they're fantastic and you do you, boo. But hearing the history of this is super neat. So we're going to talk first about auguries. I think I got a question in the last video, instead of privately, about specifically what my favorite forms of divination are. And I use auguries. I do that because I've been doing this for a really long time, and it's really hard for me not to control what the outcome of most types of divination are going to be. Whereas scrying is more, and auguries are more of a practice art. They're more personal. They're more something that you're going to have to look more deeply into yourself to find. Instead of using an outside force like a card or a key or something of that nature, which TK can sometimes interfere with. These are also the much, much older forms of divination. Basically, the auguries are the practice of reading any type of omen. I know a lot of you live your lives by omens. I do too. Not everything is an omen, but this goes way, way, way back. I mean, even we call them auguries because the Romans used the practice of counting birds, especially crows, as auguries. But we see this on every continent in the world. It's in Europe, it's in the Americas, it's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's everywhere. I don't have a ton of information on it in Australia, and I know I have a lot of viewers in Melbourne. So if you do, please send me links, send me books. It's definitely something that we can talk about. This is more traditionally done by throwing auspicious objects. An auspicious object might not be what you're particularly thinking of. It can be probably the first things that come to your mind, which are bones, especially animal bones, bones that have been used in animal sacrifices. Scapulas were really popular in ancient Egypt and Rome. Bird bones, all the way to human fingers. But it can also be something as simple as throwing a handful of rocks. Don't be afraid to throw a handful of fish tank gravel on the ground and decipher that if that's what you're feeling. Like you do you totally. That's something that's been done for millennia. Rocks are something everybody had access to. Seed pods, things like that. Really anything round, anything of a specific shape that you can throw, whether it's round or pointed, is something that you can do. I know in a lot of Hispanic cultures, things like pussy willow. This is the stalk of pussy willow. They'll take the seed pods, the little fluffs off of it, and throw those. Can be used. Pussy willow is considered lucky, so this is a great way, especially if you're looking at finding something, instead of just looking towards maybe a hint of what's to come in the future. This is never going to give you an indefinite yes or no answer, just like a tarot card. It's never going to tell you if you should quit your job. It's never going to tell you if you should break up with your boyfriend. This is more of interpreting what may come so that you can either prepare yourself or change that sort of future. You're going to have to figure out these meanings for yourself. This is something that you're going to have to look deep inside for and look at what these things mean to you, what these symbols mean to you, what these signs mean to you. It's definitely not something that you're going to be able to look into a book and find a very, very specific answer to, like a tarot card. Probably one of the earliest forms of this is horoscopy. This was done by a horospex or an orospex, and this you may have seen in some movies, and probably not believed that it was true, but it was really, really common, which is the practice of reading animal entrails. So basically, animals were sacrificed ritualistically, generally by a priest or a priestess on an altar, or even in private, in the home of a mystic or practitioner. We've all heard of the Oracle on the Mountain and Hecate in her cave, and I'm sure that this is something that was known to be practiced at this time. So this is something that they would have done if they were real people. Whether or not we can prove that historically is not really a thing, but we can make some pretty educated guesses. Animal entrails, especially the liver, were really, really popular and date all the way back to ancient Greece and Egypt. And we see, just like we see now, diagrams of the palm and how to do palm reading. Back then, you would see a lot of diagrams of animal livers and how to read those based on what signs were in them, whether they were fatty, whether they enlarged, and what that meant. The Roman concept comes from the Etruscan religion, and originated in what was then Italy about 250 to 200 BCE, is where we find our first textual evidence of this, from Lares Paulinus. But that does not mean that that was the first time that this was practiced. That just means that that's the first source material that we have where we know people are for sure looking at livers and doing this. It is very, very likely that this went much, much farther back than that. But we have to think about things that predate writing before that time and the access people had to being able to read and write. We're going to talk a lot about Etruscan beliefs in this video because a lot of these auguries kind of originated in that area and traveled through the northern invasion. We know that Paulinus wrote the Etrusca Disciplina, which were guides to Horusbean augury. And this was the Etruscan version of that. For the Etruscans, for the Italians, this was really about communion with the gods. This was not, I'm going to throw these cards and look into myself, or I'm going to look to a spirit guide, or I'm going to look to my ancestors. This went much, much higher than that. This was directly a communication with the divine. You were asking the fates to reveal to you what was going to happen, and make decisions on your life based on that. But we really see not just the Italians doing this, this traveling everywhere. Like I said, if you are a Bible nerd and look to the Bible for dates, we can see that this type of reading of animal entrails was even mentioned in the book of Ezekiel in 21:21, where he mentions the Babylonians doing it. So this practice was spread far, far, far and wide. You would think that this practice stopped, especially with the invention of the Orphic hymns, about the 2,000 years ago, when we started to see the influence of Christianity. One of the things that they used to get rid of theurgic practices was to attack the practices of ritualistic animal slaughter. Not just by the theurgists themselves, who were sacrificing bulls and sheep and that sort of thing on their altars, but even as far as sacrificing animals ritualistically, like the Judaic people did to keep their food kosher and clean. And Orpheus wrote a whole series of books really, really promoting vegetarianism. He tried to keep with theurgist practice, but completely rule this out. And you would think that that would have probably stopped this. It really didn't. This was very popular well into the Middle Ages among pagans and even among the Christians. St. Thomas of Canterbury, who was Thomas Becket, consulted a hospice before entering Brittany. And he didn't die until 1170. So we see this going on for a very long time, and in certain religions, it's still going on today. I'm not going to throw anyone's religious beliefs out there because the religions that practice this still tend to stay pretty secretive. But I think if you'll pick up some books on some various occult practices, it's not hard to figure out which ones are still doing this. I got a lot of questions last time about runes, which are probably the next earliest type of augury that we're seeing, and goes back to probably developed by the Germanic Goths from the Etruscan alphabet in Italy around 1 to 2 BC. Is when the runic alphabet came about. This isn't the practice that you're familiar with today, where you're reaching in a bag and throwing out some rocks. This is very, very different. It had a lot to do with the Norse alphabet, but the Norse alphabet wasn't exactly developed like the Latin alphabet. The Norse Vikings had an alphabet as early as about 100 AD, known as the Futhark. There are 3 versions of this. There's the Elder Futhark, which is 24 letters and was used roughly between 100 and 800 AD. The Younger Futhark, which is 16 letters, which was used between 800 and 1200 AD. And then the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, which is 33 letters, which was prevalent in England. These symbols, these letters, were written on stone, bone, antler, wood, metal, really a lot of different materials. But they weren't necessarily used as auguries in the beginning. In fact, they were most commonly used to commemorate great people. They were used as grave markers. They were used as cenotaphs, as memorials. But we see them a little bit more widely spread. We see them on cave walls. We see them on magical weapons. We see them on talismans. We see them all over the place. They're used for everyday purposes. They're used for business. They're used to write letters. They're used to write love poems. They're used to write jokes and prayers. As a matter of fact, they're used to write everything pretty much except manuscripts, which is why we have so little source material on this kind of development. And if you ever look up a book about the beginning of the runic language, you're going to see not a lot of pictures of manuscripts. There are some, but not a lot of them, because you're going to see a lot of drawings of rocks, because this is where that alphabet was most commonly used. There's a really good reason for that. The Norse believed that Odin discovered the runes when he hung himself from the world tree, and he saw the runes in the well of Erd. So the runes themselves carried a magical power. They weren't invented like we think of our alphabets today. They were literally discovered. They came from pre-existing sources. They were directly handed down from the gods. The runes existed before the Norse people knew about them. These were symbols of the gods. These were symbols of universal forces. In and of themselves, they were magic. This was something that was taken very seriously, and that's probably why we don't see too much of them being used in common manuscripts and written on paper, because this was taken so seriously. I'm not going to lie to you. I have very little Northern heritage. I do have a Scandinavian on the team here, which is where I've gotten a lot of this information from, as well as research. But the extent of my rune knowledge, I think, comes from a book which I stole from my father, which was written in the 90s and probably came as part of a set because he was curious. To be honest with you, I used this book to translate in Etruscan, mostly. So it's not something that I'm totally familiar with, but I can tell you the history of it. Today, you're going to see, if you go out and buy yourself some runes, you're going to see them come in little bags like these. These are actually the bags of someone else in my coven. They are generally made of wood, like this one, or of stone, like this one here. Traditionally, you are supposed to make your own runes. You're supposed to work with your own runes, and that's supposed to help you learn them better because this is a personal experience. But I know, dude, store-bought is fine. Not everybody has a wood burner sitting in their house and the time to cut up runes. That's fine. But the original runes weren't stones. They were rune staves, or sticks, often referred to as ogham sticks. And we see these carved sticks as early as the Bronze or the Iron Age. Roman Tacitus wrote about the Germanic people using these specifically for divination, and that's the first time that we really see runes being used in this way. And he was very specific about how this was done. A branch was cut from a nut-bearing tree. That single branch was cut into strips and marked. It was thrown on a white cloth. If this was done in a public setting, it would have been done by the priest or priestess. If it was done in a private setting, it would have been done by the patriarch of the household. The priest, or the father, very specifically, would look upwards and pray to the gods, and then pick out 3 runes. And those runes would be interpreted according to his will. There is no evidence that there was a specific way to interpret these. We're not finding how now we have books on tarot and how to interpret the cards. We're not finding manuscripts, like I said, that tell you exactly how to interpret your runes. If you go out today and decide to buy a pack of ogham sticks or runes, they're going to come and look something like this. Of course, the ones that were handmade during the Norse era probably aren't this, uniform and cutely cut and perfect as the ones I'm holding here. So if you want to do it yourself, DIY, go for it. But these are something that are available online. I think these were bought on Amazon, on Etsy. So I guess they were handmade, but not by the person that's using them. Today, a lot of people will cast these on the ground, and I think that comes a lot from a Wiccan belief and connection with the earth. Even despite the fact that this is a Norse practice, but you will still see people do this on the white cloth, because the white cloth is used as a magical sort of boundary in its own to help contain and concentrate that sort of thing. If this is something that you're going to do, that you're going to take seriously, you can definitely pick up a book on it. There's some information online. I have been told by my Nordic friend who's staring at me as I'm talking about runes. The information online is not very accurate. She brought over a little collection of books, and she's giving me this motion off camera. So she's telling me that even the books aren't really that true to history. This is really something that you're going to have to study and look really deeply into it and probably read stories on. You're going to see a lot of information online that says how they're pulled and how they're thrown is up to you. That they're pulled in groups of 9 because 9's a magical number. They're pulled in groups of 7, and this is really just not the traditional way to do it. The traditional way is 3, as we see written about in that Iron Bronze Age, and that's still the way that it's done. To people who are really, truly into kind of this pagan Norse way now. Of course, do what makes you happy, I guess. I don't know. I don't throw runes. This isn't my thing. I don't have time to say on it. So, more on something that I don't know a lot about. The I Ching was probably the next earliest form of divination. And that was developed in China around the year 8 BC. This is probably something that you did as a child the very wrong way and don't know about. You probably had a box that looked like this in your household. This is a box of pickup sticks from a classic toy company, because I had a box of pickup sticks that looked just like this when I was a child. And pickup sticks is a game that was developed from the I Ching. We know that the Far East Asians were very into divination, especially the Chinese. And I Ching was very, very important way of doing this. Traditionally, these sticks were made of yarrow stems. Yarrow is a flower that we hear about all over. I'm obsessed with yarrow. It's Achillea millefolium if you're looking for it to grow, but it grows wild in most places. I know it grows wild where I live, and I'm in the States. 50 yarrow sticks were traditionally used, but we have found evidence of them being made of things like bone and ivory. However, this is really less likely. And in fact, practitioners today who still do the I Ching say they prefer to do it with yarrow because the sticks aren't as straight, and so therefore it slows them down while they do the process. So they focus more on their meditation or whatever they're questioning. I am not going to lie to you, this is super complicated. I watched about half a dozen videos of people with a heritage much closer to the I Ching than mine doing this, and it is a lot. The sticks are, you take your 50 sticks, you divide them, you take one out, you divide them into 2 separate piles, you take one stick out of the pile, you put that in your pinky finger, then you pull them off in groups of 4, you separate those groups of 4, then you lay them down, then you put all the sticks together again, then you divide them again, then you put them in between this finger, then you pull them off by groups of 4, then some people use some coins to divine what's going to happen. I don't know how to explain it to you. There are lots of videos on YouTube if it's something that you're super interested in culturally, or if it's something from your heritage that you want to know about. A more modern practice that came about during the Jin Dynasty, 266 to 420 CE, is the Cow Chim, which is divination, also with sticks. You can buy these kinds of sticks under the term fortune-telling sticks on Amazon. They were tossed out, divination sticks tossed out of a bamboo container. Basically, one would kneel on the ground. They would either silently or quietly ask their question, and they would tilt the bamboo cup so that one stick fell out. These sticks had symbols carved on them. If more than one stick falls out, then you've shit your pants. I'm sorry, try again. And you would keep doing it until you got just one stick. Each stick corresponded to the line of a poem, and then you would use that line to help you decipher what your answer was, a lot like we talked about in the last video with the Homeric oracles, where we're really looking at some sort of hymn or poem to give us a hint as to what we're trying to divine. Probably the next most common form of divination we're going to see is oomancy, which is super fun to say, and it's a great Halloween game. We play it every year at Semaine. It's a game that you can play with your kids as long as they're careful by the stove, and it's also sort of fun. In fact, there is a long history of this being taught to children, which we'll get to kind of at the end of this, but basically the practices of oomancy is has to do with just regular household eggs. Whatever eggs you have around are fine. It doesn't have to be special. You can go to the grocery store and buy them. You don't have to own chickens or anything fancy like that. The egg whites are separated from the yolk, and then they're dropped into a pot of hot water. It's important you don't use boiling water because you will make egg drop soup. But the water does need to be hot, so that hot enough that the egg cooks as it drops into the pot. It'll form a weird kind of shape like candle wax would when it's dripping, and then these shapes are fished out, and you would look at the shape to see what it reminds you of, and that would be your divination. So a snake may mean danger. That may be an association with your goddess and mean protection. This is, once again, one of those things that's really personal. It's like tea leaf reading, where you're going to look at a picture and decide what that means to you. We don't have an origin date on oomancy, but it is likely really, really, really old. Eggs, water, and campfires go back to time immemorable. So does divination. So we can assume that this went on for a long, long time. Scholars will tell you that this likely originated in ancient Greece. Some think that the Druids in Scotland used this. But realistically, those are probably just the earliest written records that we have of this sort of thing. We do know it was super popular in about 17th century England. The reason I mentioned children is because this is one of the girls in the United States in Salem Village that were associated with the Salem witch trials. This was one of the divination games that they played that caused them to be accused of witchcraft. Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams both admitted to using oomancy by pouring egg whites into a glass, which is kind of a cross between this Eastern tradition that we see and also a similar Norse tradition. In the Norse tradition, actually, can I see that egg again? In the Norse tradition, the egg would be pierced at both ends. This is something I actually learned to do as a child too. You put a small hole in one end with a pin and a slightly larger hole in the other end with a pin, and blow into it. When you blow into it, the yolk, because it has coating around it, will stay inside of the egg unless the egg is scrambled inside of the shell. And only the egg white will come out the other end, which is kind of a neat trick. Just the albumin will shoot right out. This was blown into a cup of water. It was left overnight or for a day, and then what that image was used for the actual scrying practice. This probably led to a modern practice that you might be more familiar with, the limpias con huevos, which is an egg cleansing practice that you see in a lot of Latin traditions today. It's generally used to get off the evil eye, but you'll see in a lot of Spanish and Hispanic and Latin households that this is done anytime a friend visits and doesn't feel right, anytime someone thinks that maybe some sort of bad omen has been put on them. I know it's something that we do in this household. It's pretty widely known, not outside of Santería traditions, outside of kind of those Hispanic traditions. It's still seen, and it's even practiced out in the islands. Basically, an egg is rubbed all over the body to take off the evil. That egg is cracked into water and then examined. You're especially looking for things like blood, stuff like that, to know how bad things really are. And then the whole thing is tossed out the window, or in my house, down the garbage disposal. And this shell is completely destroyed, which is a really old tradition, destroying the shell, whether you're doing a cleansing or not. And that brings us sort of to something a little bit more vague, but for the more advanced practitioner, and also something just as old, which is scrying, which I've received a lot of questions about, probably not quite so directly. Scrying was huge, and it was really the mark of a true mystic. If you were able to scry, you were a witch. In fact, our first witch of ancient Greece, Circe, was known to scribe anywhere she went. She was the daughter of a naiad as well as Helios, so water was very important to her. She spent a lot of time next to lakes and with bowls of water doing this. But it was praised hugely by Nostradamus. We see it everywhere from Persia all the way to Joseph Smith scrying with stones to write the books of the Latter-day Saints. Probably the earliest, and scrying is basically looking at an object that seems innocuous and basically seeing a vision in it. Probably the earliest forms of scrying are hagstones or adderstones. I have one right here. Depending on what area you live in, these may be more or less common. Generally, people who follow an occult path tend to covet these stones, and they're quite expensive to buy, and as well they are kept and coveted by museums if they're older versions of them. They are made one of two ways in reality. They're made by either water dripping on a stone for thousands and thousands of years and wearing a hole in it, or with the aid of certain parasites who will help bore the hole into the stone over time. This takes thousands of years, so you can kind of see why this hole would be important. The Welsh originally thought that groups of snakes formed around stones and their saliva hardened, or the snakes bit the stone and make the hole in it. Snakes are often called adder snakes, which is where we get the term adder stone from. But more commonly, you're going to hear them referred to as hagstones. Ones that look like faces go way back into even the Neolithic era in Europe, but are also found among the indigenous Americans. So this is another thing that we see crossing continents and kind of coming over that strait and into all different sorts of continents. They are commonly worn for protection. There are stories of them giving the bearer invisibility. They're usually worn on a string around the neck. We hear stories of you being able to look through them and see the fairies. They really just go on, but everybody kind of agrees that there is something magical about these rocks. One of the primary uses for these, other than protection, is scrying. And that would be where you would literally hold the rock up to your eye and look through the hole in it to see the unseen world around you. It's believed that looking through this hole at thousands of years old can help you to see the things around you that are perhaps on the other side of the veil. Where you find this stone can sometimes influence what you see. So if your adder stone is from the beach, you may be more likely to see beach fairies, or you may be more likely to see things that occurred on those kinds of beaches. That kind of brings us to a more common and older form of scrying. We mentioned Circe and water scrying. This is something that's going to be for the slightly more advanced practitioner. But it's also something that we see mentioned again and again and again about these mystics and witches that are considered incredibly powerful. We see it mentioned in Genesis 44 in Egypt. We see it mentioned about Circe. We see over and over and over again water being used as a conduit. The mentions in the Bible talk about using silver chalices, which would be something like this. Silver bowls are often really common, so something a little bit larger. This is what I tend to use, or a handmade ceramic bowl. If you're going to do it in a ceramic bowl, I suggest using white. This is a giant Italian ceramic bowl, and this is the one that I use for it. This is also where we get the idea of moon water from. Scrying using water is traditionally not just done with tap water. I'm not going to say that looking into the mop bucket can't reveal things to you, because it does. But for the newer practitioner, they tend to go out of their way out of their way to make sure that the water that they have is special of some sort. Virga is one of the most commonly used types of water. Virga is rainwater which has never touched the ground. Virga is collected by usually placing a large bowl like the ones that you just saw on some sort of tree stump or stand during a rainstorm, and then letting the water collect inside of the bowl. This bowl then cannot touch the ground before you scry on it. This is also where we get the idea of moon water from. Moon water, I think we read a lot online about people kind of like just putting bottles of water on their windowsill, and if that's what you do and that works for you, then obviously go ahead and keep doing it. But traditionally, moon water was made by collecting virga under the light of the full moon. That water would then be left outside under the full moon for the entire night. And the idea is to have the moon's reflection be caught in the water so that some of the moon's power stays in the water, and then it would be brought wherever you're doing your scrying later, whether in older traditions, I know still in like Appalachia and places like that today, people have permanent Virga bowls outside that they clean out and use regularly, and they're positioned in such a way so that when the moon rises, it'll be caught in the water. And then you'll gaze into them to see some sort of appearance, like you would a crystal ball or a mirror or something like that. Mirror scrying is very close to water scrying, and likely we see this a little bit later because more commonly because mirrors used to be just polished pieces of obsidian or pieces of brass or that sort of thing. So we talk about using silver bowls to put the water in. This is kind of the same sort of concept. Today, we're often seen using antique mirrors, bewitched mirrors, haunted mirrors, mirrors that are passed down through family over time. This is an antique mirror that we use a lot when we're doing this sort of thing. These things, you can use what works for you. Usually this is done with a compact mirror because it's believed that mirrors tend to retain the things that they've seen. A compact mirror you can keep closed, so it only is open to see things when you want it to be. Most of us, hopefully, seen Snow White and Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. The part we probably don't pay attention to in that story is that mirror is constantly kept under a sheet. The sheet is pulled off or put on before and after scrying. So the sheet comes off and then we hear Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. There's first of them all, whatever, Grimm Brothers nonsense before they go about murdering people. And then the sheet's placed back on in the end. But earlier than this, we saw obsidian mirrors. These are still used today, especially when communicating with the dead. These are commonly placed on plates when people do dumb suppers. And they are made of an obsidian stone. Obsidian is a volcanic rock. Let me polish this one up. It looks like this. So you can see the painting in my dining room reflected in this one. Even though this is a rock, it's highly polished. You're going to see a lot of these online, and most of them are not obsidian. They are going to be black glass, so you have to be very careful if you're going to buy one of these now about your supplier. If you buy into the idea of demons, you are probably going to want to keep this in a sigilled bag. You're going to want to make sure this is protected and that sort of thing. Obsidian mirrors are considered very powerful, and they are not something that you're going to leave about your house. And that goes way, way back, which we'll kind of circle around to. I'm kind of getting to the point of the fact that these mirrors are stones. And this is very much where we get this idea of crystal balls, which is a question that I got from a lot of you, because I know it's something that we have seen a lot of. The idea of a crystal ball as we know it is sort of a Hollywood idea. I have one in my lap. I'm sorry, this thing weighs about 30 pounds, so it's really heavy for me to pick up. This is a lead crystal ball. That means that it was handmade out of lead crystal by somebody. I ordered this one online. It sits on a shelf in a dark room because it is a huge fire hazard. If the light hits this in a funny way, your house will catch on fire. It is a cool thing to have sitting in my library, which is usually dark on a shelf where the sunlight doesn't hit it. We can do that really if you have a solid stand. I don't know. Can you hold this here? if you, can you hold it with one hand? If you have a solid sand, you can do the cool Wizard of Oz picture trick where you put a picture behind it and then that picture is reflected in the ball. Generally, this would be done by putting the picture at the bottom of the stand where it's hidden. But realistically, the power from these things comes from the fact that they're stones that are super, super old. Lead crystal, it was made in a factory somewhere very, very recently. They're pretty, they're great. I obviously own one. But they're not something that I recommend really for scrying or gazing into. We have a more modern version of this, which is just the ball, which is selenite. Selenite is commonly known for cleansing. It's very pretty. You get a very nice light on it if you hold it the right way. But as you can tell, this is really milky. You're not going to see a lot in this either. They look great on the shelf. Clearly, I have a giant one here with me now. But it's far safer because it's milkier, so it's not as likely to catch anything on fire or catch the light in a funny way. But traditionally, you're going to see people use quartz, and this is what has been used for millions of years. Quartz is naturally going to have inclusions and fractures in it. You're going to see more in it. It's also going to refract the light better so that you're not getting a concentrated light beam somewhere in your house that's going to be a danger for you. This is going to sound ridiculous, but I do look into my quartz ball, and it does change what's in there over time. Now, whether that's from handling it or not in a scientific sort of way, and those inclusions changing, you can form your own theories. Maybe it's magic, maybe it's not. But the quartz is traditionally what has been used for thousands and thousands of years. In 1 CE, we see Pliny the Elder describing the Crystalium orbis, and by 5 CE, it's widespread all over the Roman Empire. It's condemned by the early medieval Christian church. It has become that popular. There is one in the scepter of Scotland, which is said to have been around since the Druidic era and made by the Druids. The Penn Museum has one depicting Osiris from ancient Egypt. Childeric I, who lived from 437 to 481 AD and was the Frankish leader of the North Imperial Gaul, had one in his grave goods. There is a long, long history of scrying stones, especially with the Romany, but with a lot of different religious groups and a lot of different ethnic groups. These balls are not found in nature round. These were balls that were passed down through generations and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed, or rolled and rolled and rolled flat. Traditionally, you would find yourself a nice stone like this piece of citrine that I'm holding here, and as you were gazing into it, you would rub it and rub it and rub it and rub it, and your daughter would rub it and rub it and rub it and rub it and rub it until it either formed a mirror or a ball. And so it is really up to you whether you're going to use a flat stone like a mirror or a round ball like I have. That's just a personal preference. I like the ball, but you do you, boo. Seriously. We hear in pop culture a lot of information about Mesoamerican skulls as being a symbol, kind of like we use crystal balls. We hear about them being used in the pre-Columbian era. And there is actually no scientific evidence of this. Sorry. There's no scientific evidence that they're old. There's no evidence that they're real. They're generally made in Germany around the 19th century AD. Oh, excuse me. They're not Mesoamerican. They're not Native American. They're not in any way real, but we hear a lot about them. We don't hear about them in their belief systems. We don't hear about them in their mythologies, but for some reason they're huge in pop culture. There is archaeological evidence of using the obsidian mirrors. There are actual obsidian mirrors found in Mesoamerica. There are drawings of them. They're depicted in art all over the place, but there are no skulls. But you're going to see these everywhere. I think this one is carnelian. But you're going to see these little crystal skulls everywhere. You're going to see big ones. You're going to hear a lot of stories about them. You've probably seen Indiana Jones. For those of you that are interested in this type of fraud, you can look up the Mitchell Hedges skull, which is probably the most famous one, that circulated in the 19th and 20th century, as being made not by machine, but by being hand rubbed over thousands of years, and it was held in secrecy, but turned out to be bought by Christie's. I mean, it's incredibly interesting stuff, but it's just, it's all hogwash. None of it is true. And I think that kind of brings us through our whole history of auguries. I know I give you a ton of information, and you probably have questions after that. I have about a minute of a lag time, so they might not come through as fast as you're asking them. So go ahead and ask if there's anything I didn't cover, or anything you want to know more about, or any pretty little thing that popped into your head. I know I try to keep up on the comments and the messages that I get, but there are a lot of them. So if there's anything you've been hiding, now is the time to let us know. I'm going to sit here. Hopefully I can help shed some light on some of the things I maybe wasn't particular about in the beginning. I think I scheduled you until 9. We got about 15 minutes. And I know some of you came in later in the video, and we'll post it to the page afterwards if you want to watch the whole thing from the beginning. It's quite a lot of information to take in, especially because this is some of the older stuff that we're looking at. This isn't, the traditional things that you're seeing in your spiritual shops and apothecaries. But I don't know, I've run out of things to talk about, unless you have something exciting to ask. I have no questions today. This is a first. Sorry, I'm looking at my IT off camera. Also looks baffled that I have no questions. Well, I guess if you have questions that we're holding, I know we're not all out of the broom closet yet. You can always feel free to message me. There's a little message button on the page. I'm in the comments. I keep an eye on those. I try to keep a pretty good eye on them. Go ahead and ask if there's anything I can do questions on. There is a post strictly for questions and answers if you scroll down the page, where you can post whatever you want there and put up whatever you're interested in or want to know more about. That's how we know what to make these videos about, are the things you guys ask. I study a lot of history, but I study a lot of history of religion, so that's whatever is in your heart to know more about, we can focus on in the future. All right, well, stay weird. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate all of you. You guys are fantastic. You really are. You're what makes this page work. Your shares, your group shares, your likes, all of that is really what keeps us going. So thanks for following. Hope you all have a great night tonight. Think long and hard on what you're doing. Have fun with your auguries.